What if I told you that some of the deadliest criminals in America weren't hardened adults, but children? Imagine an 11-year-old picking up a gun, a 12-year-old committing cold-blooded murder, or a 13-year-old luring their victim into a trap with no remorse. These aren't just shocking headlines. These are real cases. We're diving deep into the darkest corners of the justice system, where children, some barely old enough to understand the weight of their crimes, are locked away in maximum security prisons. Some of these kids showed early signs of disturbing behavior, while others seemed like normal children until the moment they snapped. But what drives a child to kill? And should a young murderer be locked away for life? Or is there hope for rehabilitation? You might think you've heard it all when it comes to crime. But I promise you, the stories we're about to uncover will leave you questioning everything you know about human nature, justice, and morality. Take Lionel Tate, for example. He was just 12 years old when he took the life of a 6-year-old girl. His defense? He claimed he was imitating professional wrestling moves. But when the details of the crime came out, they were far more brutal than any stage fight. Then there's Eric Smith, a 13-year-old with red hair, thick glasses, and a seemingly innocent face, who committed one of the most gruesome murders ever carried out by a child. And let's not forget Nathaniel Abraham, one of the youngest people in U.S. history to be tried as an adult for murder. He was just 11 years old when he pulled the trigger. Each of these cases is more disturbing than the last. And by the end of this video, you'll be asking yourself, are these kids born evil, or were they shaped by their environment? But before we begin, make sure you watch until the very end, because the final case is one of the most shocking of all. A young boy, barely old enough to understand what death truly means, committed a crime so horrifying that even seasoned detectives were left speechless. Now, let's step inside the minds of the deadliest kids in U.S. prison. Case 1. Lionel Tate, the 12-year-old who killed like a pro wrestler. It started as an innocent night, just two kids watching TV, laughing, playing around. But by the time the sun came up, one of them was dead, and the other would become one of the youngest people in U.S. history to be sentenced to life in prison. Lionel Tate was only 12 years old when he committed a murder so brutal that even seasoned detectives struggled to believe a child was capable of it. His victim? A 6-year-old girl named Tiffany Yunick. Tiffany was tiny, weighing just 48 pounds. Lionel was nearly double her size. According to Lionel's story, he and Tiffany had been watching professional wrestling on TV. Inspired by what he saw, Lionel decided to practice some moves on her. That's his version of events. But the autopsy told a much darker story. Tiffany's injuries were catastrophic. A fractured skull, a broken rib, a lacerated liver, internal bleeding so severe that doctors compared her injuries to those of someone who had fallen from a 3-story building. A simple wrestling accident? That's what Lionel's defense argued. But prosecutors weren't buying it. They pointed out that Tiffany's injuries weren't from a single blow or an accidental fall. They were the result of a prolonged violent assault. She had been stomped on, beaten, and ultimately left to die. And here's the part that shocked everyone. After Tiffany stopped moving, Lionel didn't call for help. He didn't rush to get an adult. Instead, he went to the kitchen and grabbed himself a snack. That's right. While Tiffany lay lifeless on the floor, Lionel casually ate a bag of chips, as if nothing had happened. When authorities arrived, the story only got stranger. Lionel's mother, a Florida state trooper, initially defended her son. She claimed he was just a child who didn't understand what he had done. But the court saw things differently. At just 14 years old, Lionel was charged as an adult and sentenced to life in prison without parole. A 12-year-old boy had killed a 6-year-old girl, and now, the justice system had to decide. Was Lionel a monster or just a kid who made a terrible mistake? The case sparked a nationwide debate about whether children should ever be sentenced to life in prison. Was Lionel beyond saving? Or was he just a product of his environment, raised on violent TV and lacking the judgment to know right from wrong? Here's where things take another twist. Years later, Lionel's conviction was overturned on appeal. He was given a second chance. But did he take it? No. Instead, Lionel kept finding himself back in trouble, committing armed robbery, violating parole, and proving that maybe, just maybe, the court had been right to lock him up in the first place. So, what do you think? Was Lionel Tate just a reckless child who didn't understand his actions? Or was there something more sinister lurking beneath the surface? And if you thought this case was disturbing, wait until you hear about the next child killer on our list, because the horror is just beginning. Case 2, Nathaniel Abraham, the 11-year-old sniper. Imagine this. An 11-year-old boy, barely old enough to understand death, picks up a gun, takes aim, and pulls the trigger. A man falls to the ground, bleeding out. And just like that, an elementary school kid becomes a killer. This isn't the plot of a crime thriller. It's the true story of Nathaniel Abraham, one of the youngest people in U.S. history to be charged with first-degree murder as an adult. The year was 1997. Pontiac, Michigan. Nathaniel was just a kid, a troubled one, but still a kid. He had a history of behavior problems, and he wasn't exactly the most disciplined student. But no one thought he was capable of what happened next. One night, Nathaniel got his hands on a .22 caliber rifle. He told friends he was going to do some shooting, but no one took him seriously. After all, he was 11. How much harm could he really do? A few hours later, 18-year-old Ronnie Green was walking out a convenience store when a bullet struck him in the head. He collapsed on the pavement, dead before he even knew what hit him. Witnesses saw nothing. No arguments, no robbery, no motive. Just a young man lying lifeless in the street. For days, the community was baffled. Who would kill an 18-year-old for no reason? Then came the shocker. Police traced the bullet back to a rifle, and that rifle led them straight to Nathaniel Abraham. When they questioned him, his response was chilling. He didn't seem to understand the gravity of what he had done. He said he was just shooting at trees and never meant to hit anyone. But the evidence told a different story. Nathaniel had been aiming directly at the street, firing multiple rounds. Whether he intended to kill Ronnie or not, one thing was certain. An 11-year-old had just committed murder. Now, here's where the case gets even more controversial. Prosecutors decided to try Nathaniel as an adult, despite his age. The public was divided. Was this kid truly a cold-blooded killer, or was he just a reckless child play with something he didn't understand? His trial became a national spectacle. On one side, the prosecution painted him as a dangerous young criminal who needed to be locked away. On the other side, the defense argued that his brain wasn't even fully developed enough to grasp the weight of his actions. In 1999, Nathaniel was found guilty of second-degree murder. Because of his age, he wasn't given a life sentence, but he did spend years behind bars. And when he was finally released in 2010, many wondered, would he turn his life around? For a while, it seemed like he might. He talked about redemption, about learning from his mistakes. But in 2019, he was arrested again, this time for drug and theft charges. The same kid who'd been given a second chance was now back behind bars. So, was Nathaniel a victim of a broken system? Or was he always destined for a life of crime? And if you think this case is disturbing, just wait, because our next child killer took things to an even darker level. Case 3, Eric Smith, the 13-year-old with the face of a child and the mind of a monster. Some killers look exactly like what you'd expect, cold, hardened criminals with dead eyes and menacing stares. But what if I told you that one of the most terrifying young murderers in U.S. history had the face of an innocent child? Thick glasses, red hair, freckles, a shy, awkward smile. That was Eric Smith. But behind that seemingly harmless exterior was something much darker, something that led him to commit one of the most disturbing crimes ever carried out by a child. It was 1993 in the quiet town of Savona, New York. Eric Smith was 13 years old, an outcast who had been bullied his entire life. His classmates made fun of his ears, his glasses, his awkwardness. He was angry, he was frustrated, and one summer day, he finally snapped. That morning, 4-year-old Derek Roby was walking alone to a summer camp just a few blocks from his home. It was supposed to be a safe neighborhood. Parents didn't think twice about letting their kids walk around. But that day, Derek never made it to camp. As Derek strolled down the street, Eric saw him, and something inside him twisted. Maybe it was years of being picked on. Maybe it was a sick curiosity. Whatever it was, he walked up to the little boy, smiled, and lured him into the woods. What happened next is the stuff of nightmares. Once they were hidden from sight, Eric snapped. He beat Derek to the ground. He strangled him. He took a rock, one big enough to fit in his hands, and smashed it against a 4-year-old skull. Again, and again, and again. But he wasn't done. Eric then took a stick and did something so grotesque that I can't even say it here. But let's just say the crime scene was so disturbing that seasoned investigators struggled to process what they were looking at. The town was in shock. A child had been murdered in broad daylight, and nobody had a clue who did it. That is, until Eric himself started acting off. He casually asked police about the case. He even told his mother, "I just want to know what it feels like to kill someone." That was enough to raise suspicions, and soon Eric cracked. He confessed, and when police asked him why he did it, his answer was haunting. "I just wanted to see what it felt like." At 13, Eric Smith was charged with second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 9 years to life, spending decades behind bars. Every few years, he came up for parole, but he was denied again and again. Then, in 2022, after nearly 30 years, Eric Smith was finally released. He walked out of prison a free man. But here's the question. Should he have been given a second chance? Or was a kid capable of that level of brutality always destined to kill again? And if you think this case was unsettling, just wait. Our next young killer wasn't just violent. He was a full-blown child serial killer. Case 4, Jesse Pomeroy, America's first child serial killer. Some killers are born in darkness. Others are shaped by cruelty. But Jesse Pomeroy? He was something else entirely. A child so twisted, so brutal, that even hardened criminals feared him. The year was 1871, Boston, Massachusetts. Jesse Pomeroy was just 12 years old, but already there was something terrifying about him. His face was disfigured. One of his eyes was clouded and milky white, giving him an unsettling, almost inhuman stare. But it wasn't his looks that scared people. It was what he did to other children. Young boys started turning up with horrifying injuries. Some were found with their bodies slashed. Others had been tied up, beaten, and left to suffer in the cold. The victims all told the same story. A strange-looking boy had lured them away, then tortured them for fun. Jesse was caught and sent to reform school. Authorities thought that would be the end of it, but they had no idea what kind of monster they were dealing with. 2 years later, Jesse was released early, a mistake that would cost 2 children their lives. Just a month after his release, 10-year-old Katie Curran went missing. Her parents searched everywhere, but she had vanished without a trace. Then, days later, a young boy named Horace Millen was found dead in a field. His body had been mutilated so viciously that even seasoned police officers were left sickened. His throat was slashed, his chest was stabbed, and his face was barely recognizable. It didn't take long for suspicions to fall on Jesse. When police searched his mother's shop, they found Katie Curran's body hidden in the basement. Her throat slit, her small body crammed into a tiny hole. Jesse had killed again. Now, remember, this wasn't a grown man. This wasn't some terrifying adult serial killer. This was a 14-year-old boy. Jesse Pomeroy was arrested, and when they questioned him, he didn't cry. He didn't beg for forgiveness. He just sat there, staring with that eerie, dead eye, as if none of it mattered. The court didn't know what to do with him. He was too young for the death penalty, so they sentenced him to life in solitary confinement, the harshest punishment a child had ever received in U.S. history. And that's where he spent the rest of his days. Alone, forgotten, growing old in a tiny cell, with only his own twisted mind for company. But here's the question. Was Jesse Pomeroy a product of his time? A boy shaped by abuse and neglect? Or was he simply born evil? And if you thought Jesse was terrifying, our final case is one of the most shocking yet. A child who killed in cold blood and got away with it. Stay with me, because this story is about to get even darker. Case 5, the girl who killed and walked free. Most child killers spend years, sometimes their entire lives, behind bars. But what if I told you there was one who committed murder in cold blood and got away with it? No prison, no life sentence, nothing. This is a chilling case of Mary Bell, the girl who killed and walked free. It was 1968 in Newcastle, England. Mary was just 10 years old when she committed her first murder. Her victim? A 4-year-old boy named Martin Brown. Martin was found dead inside an abandoned house, his tiny body lying cold on the floor. At first, authorities assumed it was an accident. There were no clear signs of struggle. But soon, disturbing details began to emerge. Days after Martin's death, police discovered something truly unsettling. Someone had broken into a local nursery school and left behind creepy, handwritten notes that read, "I murder so that I may come back." At the time, no one knew who wrote them, but soon, another tragedy would reveal the truth. Just a few weeks later, another little boy, Brian Howe, went missing. The search lasted hours until his body was discovered in a field. But this time, it wasn't just murder. It was something far worse. Brian's lifeless body had been mutilated. His hair had been cut off in clumps. Tiny wounds were carved into his skin. And the most horrifying part? Someone had used a razor blade to carve the letter M into his stomach. That's when police realized they weren't dealing with an accident or a random killing. They were dealing with a child murderer. Investigators started questioning kids in the neighborhood, trying to figure out if anyone had seen anything. And that's when they met Mary Bell. She was acting strangely. While the community mourned, Mary smirked. She made disturbing comments about the murders, even laughing about them. And when Brian's funeral took place, she stood outside his house, watching, smiling. Something wasn't right. Police brought Mary in for questioning. At first, she denied everything, but when they pressed her, she finally gave herself away. She described the crime scene in shocking detail. Details that only the killer could know. That was enough. Mary Bell, just 11 years old, was arrested for the murder of 2 children. At trial, psychologists labeled her a psychopath in the making. A young girl with no remorse, no empathy, and a terrifying thirst for control. But here's the twist. Mary was too young for a life sentence. Instead of prison, she was sent to a psychiatric facility. And then, years later, something even more shocking happened. At the age of 23, Mary Bell was released. She was given a new identity, protected by the government, and allowed to live a normal life, as if she had never killed 2 innocent children. And to this day, she is somewhere out there, living under a new name, a free woman. So what do you think? Should Mary Bell have been locked away forever? Or does a child, no matter how evil, deserve a second chance? One thing's for sure, when it comes to child killers, this case proves that sometimes monsters don't stay locked away. Conclusion: the darkest side of childhood. When we think of childhood, we think of innocence, playgrounds, laughter, a time before the darkness of the world seeps in. But these cases prove a terrifying reality. Sometimes that darkness isn't learned. Sometimes it's already there. From Nathaniel Abraham, who killed at just 11 years old Eric Smith, whose rage turned him into a murderer, to Jesse Pomeroy, America's first child serial killer. Each of these young criminals forced society to confront a horrifying question. Can a child be truly evil? For some, these killers were victims of abuse, neglect, or mental illness. Kids who never had a chance at a normal life. But for others, their crimes were too brutal, too calculated, to be dismissed as childhood mistakes. They weren't just lost children. They were something far more sinister. And perhaps the most disturbing part, some of them got out. Mary Bell is still free, living under a new identity. Nathaniel Abraham was released, only to return to crime. And Eric Smith, after decades behind bars, is now a free man, walking among us. So, we have to ask ourselves, what happens when child killers grow up? Do they change? Do they regret? Or does that darkness stay buried inside, waiting? One thing is certain. Evil doesn't always with the face of a hardened criminal. Sometimes it smiles with freckles. Sometimes it walks the halls of middle school. And sometimes it looks just like an ordinary child. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the world of true crime. What do you think? Can a child ever truly change, or does the darkness stay with them forever? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay safe.